Okay, this is a brief review of Chapter 7, Identities and Inequalities, Inequalities in Law and Justice. Okay, so we've talked about the social construction of a lot of things, and just as our identities are socially constructed and defined by the culture, so are our laws, as laws are often a reflection of our value system that's been kind of cemented or codified into law. So, when it comes to power, politics, and legal definitions, the chapter talks about how conflict theorists argue that the coercive power of the state tells us that laws are in our best interest. But conflict theorists argue that often laws are actually political instruments that are used by elites to further their own interests at the expense of others. So, laws are often developed by legislators that are not necessarily similar to the constituents that they serve. So, today, running for office requires millions of dollars, meaning that most receive a lot of money from lobbyists and powerful interests, and that can kind of color their priorities or their perspectives on who they're serving. So, there's also just the nature that a lot of these people, their backgrounds, a lot of people in elected office, especially at the highest levels of power, like in Congress, are often millionaires themselves. So their life experiences, their standard of living, is going to be very different. So they're not going to have the same kind of understandings as a lot of their constituents. Meaning, if you don't have to deal with, you know, trying to seek out financial aid, if you don't have to ever have welfare, if you don't have to ever, worry about the costs of the rising cost of healthcare because you're wealthy, then those problems through that privilege perspective just become not existent. So they aren't advocating for the rights of a lot of poor people because they just don't really understand what their lives are. When it comes to laws of intimacy, not just the larger criminal laws are affected by our society, by our understandings, by our behaviors, but laws also control our private and intimate choices. So, for example, the state does not tell you who you're allowed to fall in love with, but marriage is also a legal contract with specific age requirements, often health requirements, inheritance rules, so on. So the country has less strictures than other countries and less than in the past, but as sociologists, we know that society is very segregated. So the people that we fall in love with are typically like us, right? So when it comes to race, class, religion, culture, etc., we tend to marry people that are very similar to us in a lot of different social characteristics. And largely that's just because we live segregated lives. Obviously, as a college student, you come in contact with a lot of people from various backgrounds and cultures that really is fostered by the university as a social location. But for the majority of us in our lives, we end up, there's this idea of the soulmate that we find, right? But typically, a lot of people fall in love with someone within a 10-mile radius. So if you live in a very, racially segregated, class segregated area, then you're going to end up with someone that's pretty similar to you. Or if you live in an ethnic enclave or things like that, right? So miscegenation is another part of this. So the fear of interracial relationships has really been a part of American culture and politics and has been in the law for over 400 years. So laws against miscegenation originated in the colonies. And so again, miscegenation is just different racial groupings of people marrying each other, right? So, these laws developed in the colonies when they developed the concept of a one-drop rule, which effectively locked people of mixed races from the hierarchy of white privilege. So it was basically a way to say that, let's say you are of mixed race, you have a white parent and a black parent, then you are considered black, even though technically you're half white, you're half black. Because of the idea of white supremacy and that kind of racial purity eugenics argument, there was this move to basically say that if someone was, mixed race, that they wouldn't have the same opportunities and legal opportunities and, privileges as whites would. So, this hierarchy of white privilege affected our understanding of different groups, especially when it comes to the sexuality of African Americans. When you're looking at it, in the Jim Crow era, as one example, black women were not considered able to be raped, right? That only white women were considered to be able to be raped. So a woman could not even report a crime as rape up until the civil rights era. So this is a huge problem where there was obviously a rhetoric in society that justified this kind of, sexual violence against women of color as just, matter of fact. While at the same time, a lot of the societal stereotypes actually focus on the reverse, some weird manufactured fear from not just Jim Crow era, but also from films like Birth of a Nation, that said that the real threat to white women was black men and their hypersexuality, that black men all just wanted to basically find white women, and that there's some sort of drive, right? And so this really justified a lot of the violent crimes that were done against African American men based on this logic, right? Lynching, which often involved not just beating someone to death in front of a crowd of people, right? But also often included mangling of a person's genitals, right? So there was obviously a sexual component to those lynchings. So it's really interesting that, like, while they were blaming black men for wanting to rape white women, right, in some mythical sense of giving it as an excuse to control the African American male population, there were actually white men raping black women with no justice, right, for those women at all. So we have to remember that this was not very long ago. If we're talking about pre-civil rights era, we're talking about, just a generation and a hay, right? This is very not long ago. So the number of interracial marriages that we have nowadays is obviously on the upswing because a lot of the miscegenation laws didn't go away in some states up until the 70s. So obviously, if you were legally prohibited from marrying someone of a different race, you probably wouldn't, right? Because you can't. Like, it's a contract with the state. So it makes sense that there would obviously be a large upswing nowadays because it's actually legally possible. But of course, also because, society, as it becomes more common, society has more acceptance for the idea of interracial marriage. When it comes to same-sex marriage, this is a kind of more recent issue, right, of the state trying to control who can be married. So we see that this still goes on today. And really, it's now legal across all 50 states because of a Supreme Court objection. But, there were very powerful interests that campaigned to try to prevent same-sex couples from being able to marry, right? It was considered that, marriage is only between a man and a woman, right? Or at least it was in the legal definition of the term. So there were some advocates that said, okay, well, have something that's similar but doesn't have the word marriage, like domestic partnerships, right? But again, the whole reason for why a lot of same-sex communities really fought for the right to have marriage is because of the kind of protections that the marriage gives you as a couple. So let's say your significant other is dying in the hospital. Unless you're family, you don't get to make the medical decisions. You don't get to inherit their property. You don't get to be in the room with them when these things are happening, right? And these serious illnesses. So that's a huge concern for a lot of same-sex couples that, when the law first, went into place, basically because of the, Prop 8 and other rules in certain states that were ruled unconstitutional and moved all the way up the chain to the Supreme Court, a lot of couples that got married had been together for like 30 plus years at that point, but they saw it as a way that they could then protect their future together. Right? So there's all of these egregious examples. So it's interesting that we still see how the state itself, even though something like who you marry, who you fall in love with, who you have a family with, is a very personal issue, it's still something that society, especially the legal system, is dictating for us what's appropriate and what's not. When it comes to race, class, and justice, inequalities in the laws can be seen most glaringly in the disproportionate amount of people of color who are incarcerated under mass incarceration. And a lot of this has to do with the war on drugs, which, we're going to watch the film that addresses that a little bit. But anyway, racial profiling is a common issue, right? Or it's been, a issue that a lot of communities have tried to fight against to have laws put into place to prohibit it, right? So it's basically this situation where if someone is considered deviant because of the color of their skin, because of their social class, because of the neighborhood they live in, you fit the description, so you're going to be profiled, right? So that's a huge problem for communities of color that just because of the larger stereotypes and stigmas, not just in the community, from the media, from middle class culture that blame them for their own poverty and, negative life situations such as, drug crimes, gangs, that kind of dilapidation of the inner city, without actually looking at any of the structural factors of like endemic poverty, of how racial policy has set up a different opportunity structure for minorities than it did for whites, how all of the industries that used to support the inner city are now gone, right? All of these kind of things. Instead of looking at the reality of it, people like to just blame and victim blame, right? So, a lot of this has to do with just saying like, well, if you're a person of color, you seem more likely to have been that criminal just because society has deemed you as a criminal, right? And as we'll see in the film, Michelle Alexander really puts it very eloquently in her book, The New Jim Crow, where she says that we've gone through different racial caste systems in America. So when slavery was created as a racial caste system, so was this kind of notion of white supremacy cemented into our legal system and our laws. But once slavery went away, racism did not. It just changed. And so she argued that then the elite racial groups had to institute a new system of racial control, a new racial caste system, which was Jim Crow segregation, right? But as the Civil Rights era wore on and as Jim Crow was challenged in the courts and broke down, there needed to be a new racial caste system, something to still control Black and brown bodies. And she argues that in the modern form, that's mass incarceration. So she says that during these different racial caste systems, the identity or how we label people of color has to do with those systems. So meaning under slavery, African Americans were considered property. They were considered animals, right? Under Jim Crow segregation, they were considered inferior, legally second-class citizens. And at the end of that era, into the modern era of mass incarceration, African Americans are labeled as criminal, right? So it's really just a way to control. And also those kind of dog whistles of law and order and things like that really came about during an era where civil rights leaders were challenging very racist laws, like sit-ins, demonstrations, going to lunch counters, things like that. And the white establishment felt that this was very threatening to their power, so they saw them as criminals and they labeled them as criminals. So that's kind of like the longer, historical relevance of these things. So when we talk about class and crime, when politicians talk about fighting crime, they're typically talking about street crime, right? How often do you hear a politician talk about taking on corporate welfare, right? Or, white collar crimes or any of those kind of issues. I mean, unless it's like Bernie or Elizabeth Warren or somebody, right? But many people die in a lot of hazardous industry accidents, right? Which is way more than an effect than street crime has, let alone things like Cancer Alley, where people live next to petrochemical plants and develop a disproportionate amount of cancers, which are predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. So again, whether it's crime, whether it's environmental hazards, we tend to see crimes as more deviant when they correspond to the poor because we see the poor as deviant, right? We see them as not as worthy, as backwards, as somehow just not as well developed as the middle class, as the rich. And this is something that the culture really tells us, that lays out for us, that different groups of people have different worth depending on their place in the social hierarchy. And we really buy into this crap, right? And we really do see people as having different levels of worth based on things they cannot control, like their race and their social class or their gender or their sexuality, right? When it comes to prisons, politicians have long increased mass incarceration due to their desire to be tough on crime, because that proves very successful for them in the years when they're trying to get reelected, right? There's not a lot of people out there that are like, hey, let's let criminals out. And, in the film, they get into this a little bit, but there's been a long legacy since the war on drugs was started by Richard Nixon of connecting political ambitions to being tough on crime. So we have a lot of these issues with recidivism, which just means that, there's a lot of people that go to prison that end up back in prison after a short time after they're released. So, the only thing that research has shown tends to lessen recidivism is job training programs or an education, getting a college degree while locked up, right? These things give people an opportunity to find a path when they leave prison that's not back to the underground economy, that's not back to, drug economy. So the war on drugs, though, and its use of mandatory minimum sentences has dramatically changed our prison population. where now you have so many people in prison that are nonviolent drug offenders, versus in the past where the majority of people locked in prison were violent offenders, as it should be, right? Because those are the people that are more criminal, more damaging to society. When a lot of these nonviolent drug offenders, we found that, again, research shows that giving them drug treatment programs or other, kind of skills-based programs in lieu of going to jail is actually much more effective. Because if you take a drug addict and you lock them in jail for 30 days and then you let them back out, or even a year, not only do they find the drugs that are already in the prisons, but they're just going to go back to their drug use if you don't deal with the underlying issue of their addiction. A lot of people are motivated to use drugs as a way to deal with their traumas. So if you have a population of people living in a violent neighborhood, dealing with a lot of negative life circumstances, it makes sense that they might turn to alcohol or drugs or things like this because, getting psychological counseling is very expensive, and that's not something that is easily offered as, $10 worth of drugs or alcohol. So this is, a larger problem where, of course, people are recidivizing because we're not dealing with the underlying issues of why they went there in the first place, right? But giving them an education, job training, some opportunity to do something different with their lives when they get out is very effective in making sure they don't come back. When it comes to race, class, and death, the death penalty itself, right? Obviously, research on the death penalty over and over has found that it's not actually a very effective deterrent, largely because, kind of not to take a deep dive into crim here, but basically, when looking at how the deterrence frameworks work, part of it is the certainty of being caught, the severity of, what your sentence would be, and, celerity, the swiftness with which the punishment happens. What they found is that certainty is the most important variable there. So the death penalty ends up not being as effective because unless you have a certainty that it will be applied to you, it doesn't serve as an effective deterrent. So it's really an interesting phenomenon where we can see it's not an effective deterrent when we look at how there are more capital crimes, like more homicides, in states that have the death penalty statute than in states that don't. So it's an interesting phenomenon, right? You would think, okay, well, if you make it life in prison or, death penalty for a crime, you wouldn't commit that crime. But then when they interview these criminals later and say, well, why did you do this if you knew it was a capital crime? Most say, well, I didn't think I'd get caught, right? So again, it's not the most effective deterrent. But when it comes to the racial disparities within these systems, the people that are then prosecuted, the people that are incarcerated, the length of their sentences are also affected by race, class, and gender. 54% of all people on death row are Black or Latino, but this is extremely disproportional to their percentage in the overall population. So race is really a mitigating factor here because it determines who we think is threatening and who we don't. So if we see someone as more threatening than another person just based on their skin tone, just based on how much money their family has, right? Then that's why we let bankers, get away with these extortion crimes where they make billions of dollars off of us and we have to bail out the companies or have to bail out, all these workers, don't get their pensions and retirements and they end up in poverty. But we don't see them as the criminals. Because they have so much power and status, right? They're what we all want to be. They're at the top of all the hierarchies, right? So the problem often leads to where we don't really see crime as a matter of actual severity. We see it as a reflection of who has power and who doesn't. And so we let people with power get away with a lot when we let people with no power have no leeway. Also, gender is another issue when it comes to the criminal justice system. So when it comes to gender in the law, throughout history, women have been denied many legal rights that men take for granted. So in the 18th century, once you married, you were no longer an individual. If you were a woman, you were legal property of your husband. So while the law would allow men to abuse their wives, force them to stay home, force them to have sex without it being considered rape, all of these things came from a, gendered social construction and understanding of what a woman's role was in these relationships, right? So obviously, we've changed some of this. Some laws have addressed sex discrimination in employment, in education. Amendments like Title IX attempts to deal with educational inequalities. We now have Family Leave and Medical Act that allows mothers and fathers to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid sick leave to raise a child or to take care of a sick relative. But the problem with that is the unpaid part. Most people can't afford to not work for 12 weeks, right? Versus pretty much every other country in the entire world, minus one country that's more just a small island filled with indigenous populations, offer some sort of paid leave for um, for parents when they have a child, right? So if you look at places that are comparable to our development, like Europe, they have, in some countries like France, you get about 6 months paid and you can take up to a year off depending on how your employer finances these things, which is extremely different than 12 weeks of unpaid labor. So obviously, this is really effective because then women end up taking off time to take care of children because of the social construction that that's their role. And so they end up affecting their job continuity, their job success, being promoted or being seen as a stable employee. This ends up affecting their retirements later in life because they've taken in less money. So all of these things, again, kind of come together. So the laws themselves also have this kind of impact. So sexual harassment is another interesting one of these things. So even though sexual harassment laws were enacted over 20 years ago, it's still very common and extremely prevalent issue in the modern world of work. Harassment and sexual misconduct are particularly problematic in the military, right, where women are often ignored, dismissed because they bring up issues of sexual assault. And so these issues continue because, at least in the situation in the military, there was kind of the command structure has something to do with this. So even if a person is tried by a military tribunal and found guilty of a rape, if a superior officer dismisses it, then it's dismissed, right? So, part of this has to do with if we're not acknowledging the severity of these issues, then we don't even know it's happening, right? So sexual harassment's an interesting thing too, because as a term, it didn't even come about until the second wave of the women's rights movement. And it was a major push by feminists to say that, women should be able to go to work and they should be able to be in an environment where they're not being groped, harassed, threatened, or quid pro quo harassment where they say, oh, well, either have sex with me or you're fired, or, if you have sex with me, I'll give you a promotion, or things like that. So the problem, though, is that we all have had training on this. Like if you have any job, you've had to have some sort of sexual harassment training, but it's still a constant prevalent issue. And a lot of it has to do with creating a hostile work environment. So feminist sociologists interpret sexual harassment as an attempt to reinforce a position of power. People misinterpret sexual harassment as a sexual thing because of the word sexual in it. But really, it's just it's similar to rape in the fact that it's not about sex as much as it's about power and control and domination, right? Like the famous Anita Hill case where Clarence Thomas, now a Supreme Court justice, basically sexually harassed her while he was working for the EOPS, which is really terribly, painfully ironic, the organization that oversees sexual harassment complaints, and he was sexually harassing multiple female subordinates. Basically, he asked her out for a date. She was like, no thanks. And then after that, he started sexually harassing her, which was, talking about pornography, referring to himself as Long Dong Silver. Again, you can't make this shit up. And doing things as egregious as like putting a pubic hair on her soda can, things like that, which none of those things, if you look at them, are actually him trying to get her to have sex with him, right? Those things aren't in an effort to now she'll want to date me because I referred to myself as Long Dong Silver. He's doing it to make her uncomfortable, to make her humiliated, to make her, to dominate her, to take control and power away from her because he felt control and power was taken away from him and being rejected, right? So that's really what sexual harassment is about. It's a lot about reinforcing a position of power. When it comes to gender and violence, definitions of male power are imbued with sexual aggression and physical violence. The way that we understand our sex roles has everything to do with, men are supposed to seek out women. In relationships, men are supposed to be sexually dominant. They're supposed to want sex. Women are supposed to be passive about it and hold out. So there's all of these weird things that are built into our cultural scripts that legitimize men using violence, especially the fact that, in a lot of ways, whether it's sexual aggression or otherwise, we don't allow men to express themselves in holistic, emotional ways, meaning men are not allowed to cry. They're not allowed to seek help. They're not allowed to be weak, perceived as weak in any particular way. So as a result, the only things they're allowed to express publicly are violence, anger, aggression. So that's often to hide their pain, their anxiety, their sadness, the things that they're not allowed to talk about. So this kind of gendered nature of how we've constructed masculinity as something that, someone takes your power, you got to go take it back, is really just spurning on a lot of our societal problems when it comes to domestic violence and battering, when it comes to mass shootings that often involve a domestic aspect, right? Or, those kind of uh, murder suicides that are all too prevalent, right, that we hear about almost every day in the US, are really coming from a lot of our cultural understandings. When it comes to the intersections of poverty, gender, and human trafficking, violent victimization often crosses national boundaries. So human trafficking is an example of that kind of violence, and estimates range from 12.3 million to 27 million adults and children are bought, sold, transported, and kept against their will. So this has to be, a more prevalent issue in our culture, but it's really not, right? And this is whether or not, some are forced to work in sweatshops and become domestic servants. Others are sold into prostitution, sex tourism, or into forced marriages. So again, this isn't just an international issue because estimates have over 17,000 people being trafficked into the US each year, and they assume that that estimate is very low. Because traffickers find victims in several ways. So they may offer fake job advertisements in places with high unemployment and poverty, right? So they'll say, oh, we really need you to come here for a job. But then they get trafficked, they get controlled, they aren't able to actually control the wages that they would have been earning. And they're just put into a very servile domestic position or, work in a sweatshop factory labor or otherwise. There's also fraudulent modeling or travel agencies that are put together to lure unsuspecting victims to make them feel like, okay, well, I don't have any opportunities here, so if I move to this other place, away from the protection of my family, my friends, my legal system, right, then I'll be able to get a job and send a remittance back to my family. But oftentimes, it's taking advantage of these people in dire economic circumstances that are outside of their control because of geopolitical globalization issues. They're just left without gainful employment, so they get manipulated through this, right? So they often target just the most marginal people, and they use threats, intimidation, violence to force victims to engage in sex acts or to work as slaves for the traffickers' financial gain. When it comes to intimate violence, first up, rape and sexual assault. In the US, rape is the most frequently committed but least reported crime. I mean, let that sink in. Most frequently committed, most least reported crime. The most common reason given by victims for not reporting is fear or retaliation. So rape and sexual assault are two of the most personal violent crimes. In studies on college campuses, 90% of women who were sexually assaulted knew their attacker. Rape is often a reflection of broader patterns of gender inequality, like how women were considered property of their husbands, right? This idea that there couldn't be marital rape because you own her, right? Which again, I hate to be that guy that always brings that up, but that's something that Trump's attorney said on the campaign trail when they asked him about the charges that Trump's first wife claimed that Trump raped her and then later settled that dispute in a non-disclosure agreement. And the lawyer said, well, that's crazy. You can't rape your wife. And it's like, of course you can, because people are autonomous, right? They're able to control their own bodies and you can't force someone to do something. But there's still this outdated notion that used to be in the law that says that women are just property, right? So globally, rape is often used as a wartime tactic of terror. So it could be to terrorize people or revenge, to retaliate against, basically they humiliate and, dishonor the men in that particular, system or conflict by raping and assaulting their wives, their children, right? And so it's really interesting, too. There's a lot of issues where sexuality also comes into play with this, where there's examples of, people that are sexual minorities, especially lesbians, experiencing rape as a result of trying to, quote, cure someone, right? And this is really part of the societal rhetoric that says, oh, well, if someone's a lesbian, it's just because they haven't, found the right guy yet or something like that, instead of it being, of a sexual identity, right? That's something that's personal to somebody. So not only is that used around the world, but that often also happens in our country, right? So we have to really look as sociologists critically at how the power structures, how the societal dynamics, lead into this instead of challenging it. So feminist theorists argue that throughout history, men have used rape and the threat or fear of rape to exert control over women. In some cultures that are more patriarchal, women are hurt, they're imprisoned, or killed for being rape victims, as it's seen as bringing shame to their families. So rape myths also feed into the reasons why women don't report their rapes and the reasons that offenders get away with it. So we look at victims very critically in order to find ways to blame them for their victimization. And of course, race and class plays into whether we interpret a woman as a victim. So women learn from the societal messages that it's their responsibility to prevent rape. So women alter their behaviors in their daily lives to live in the shadow of rape. And I mean, we can see this even with the Blasey Ford testimony, right? That happened, about the Supreme Court justice, basically saying that, she was an extremely credible witness. She talked about her personal experiences and she was still discounted. So what that message is sent to so many women that, again, most underreported crime, is that no one's going to take it seriously, because if a woman with that much status and power and that much bravery stands up and puts herself in that limelight, she's discredited, she's attacked, she got doxxed, she had to move out of her house, her parents had to move out of their house, and, her whole life has been upended. Why? Because she tried to call truth to power, right? And so there's always this threat of shaking up that system that has to be controlled. So it really, even though it is a personal thing, it comes down to these societal structures of power, of who's given more authority, who's given more weight, and who's given more worth in the society. Intimate partner violence is another issue related to this. So according to the World Health Organization, the greatest threat of violence to women worldwide is in their own homes. Exact statistics are completely impossible, right? It's very difficult to get a good sense of these things because they're extremely underreported from both victims and from institutions themselves, right, that don't want these numbers to be tallied. So many incidents are dismissed as accidents, but all estimates have the prevalence of IPV show that it's much, much higher than reported rates. And how do we know this? Largely from victimization surveys and other research that fills in the gaps between official reported totals and the actual amount of people seeking help for these issues. So roughly 1.5 million women and over 800,000 men are assaulted by an intimate partner annually in the US. So 1.5 million women, 800,000 men, and those are low estimates. So clearly these are huge issues of epidemic levels. So, also escaping abuse is much more difficult than most people assume, because the structure is really not there to support victims in the long term, especially if they're men or from a same-sex couple, right? So for women that are facing abuse or IPV, there are shelter systems in place, there's certain programming, transitional housing, things of this nature. But they are, again, limited, and it's also something that there's only so many positions and so many spots available. There's only so much funding to these organizations. And like I said, for any groups that aren't considered that majority population, for men, there is no shelter system. Where do they go? Researchers found that men will not leave in a situation where they're facing violence from their female partner if they are the breadwinner, because they feel that that's going to negatively affect their children, right? So we often blame women, like, why do they stay? But there's also men in those situations, but they're seen as even less, credible, because basically the societal notions that say that men control women or should be able to control women really affect the way that the police interpret it, the way that prosecutors interpret it, the way that social workers interpret it, the way that shelters interpret it, the way that society, juries, judges, all these people that are involved in this legal system interpret these issues, right? Because they see it like, oh, well, a guy should be able to defend himself. It's like, yeah, but just because your wife is hitting you doesn't mean you hit her back. You were probably taught to be a decent human person that doesn't hit other people. So, but then again, it becomes this kind of societal notion of, well, men should be able to control women, so therefore somehow it's just you as a man that's the problem and not the violent offender is the problem, which it's always the violent offender. Hint, spoiler, it's always the violent offender that's at fault, not the person who has had violence happen to them. And of course, for same-sex couples, this is also difficult too because there's not a lot of understandings about this. Like, so for example, in California, we're a mandatory arrest state where if people are called out on certain domestic calls, someone's getting arrested, right? So in these situations, this is often seen as very gendered. Like they'll show up to the situation and they'll arrest the guy. But what if he's the one that's the victim, right? That's not really taken into consideration. And also, when it comes to same-sex communities, what if both of them are men? What if none of them are men, right? What do you do then, right? So the problem is that we need more training, more funding, more resources for, kind of the organizational literacy to understand how, different groups deal with this when it comes to gender and sexuality, but really also when it comes to race and class. There's a lot of different ethnicities or immigrant populations that might have different understandings about, violence or just how justified that use of violence is. So there's a lot of populations that just don't even realize that what's happening to them is legally violence, right? So this is another issue too, where you have to have programs that aren't just a one-size-fits-all approach that's only tailored towards like a white middle-class norm. You have to have approaches to intimate partner violence and rape and sexual assault that are looking at different groups of people and the different needs that they have, right? So men who are raped or sexually assaulted have different needs often than women who are raped and sexually assaulted, right? Sexual minorities might have different needs than those, right? Or racial or ethnic minorities. So these things have to be taken into account so that everyone can actually get help that they need when they're the victims of violence.